Hello and welcome. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and today we're talking with Jeff Reichert of Veeam Government Solutions about cyber resiliency and what it does and doesn't mean and how agencies can achieve it. Jeff is Veeam's Vice President for Public Sector and Compliance Strategy. Let's jump in, shall we, Jeff?
Sounds great. Thanks, Vanessa.
So what do you mean by cyber resiliency, and how is that different from high availability or disaster recovery? Those have been federal focuses for a few years. Could you talk to that?
Yes, absolutely. It's certainly true. We've been talking about things like HA, disaster recovery, continuity of operations for many years. Cyber resiliency is a little bit different than that. It takes some of the ideas that form continuity of operations or high availability or DR, things like backups, things like recovering workloads or replicating workloads or having alternate sites. But it adds the critical element that cyber resiliency is designed to deal with an active adversary, not just with a power failure or with something like a storm or a natural event. And of course, what we now need to do is take those same kind of capabilities that we used for high availability and DR, things like monitoring alternate sites, backing up and replicating data. And we have to apply those to a situation where both the public and the private sector are facing essentially a state of ongoing constant attack on their information technology resources. I'll borrow a phrase from Chris Inglis, our National Cyber Director, whom I heard speak last week. Mr. Inglis likes to use the phrase, defense is the new offense. It's no longer enough to set up a defense, or in the case of backup and replication, set up your backups or set up your alternate site and figure that your work is done. Defense now and cyber resiliency now requires the same kind of ongoing attention and creativity and constant vigilance that we typically think of for things like offensive operations, but we've got to apply that now to defense.
Right, there's just a much broader attack capability out there, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's always on too. And
Right.
always improving. So let's get a little bit deeper then and talk about some of the specific capabilities or requirements around data protection that idea of cyber resiliency really requires.
Sure. So for years, when we've talked about backup and high availability, we've used rules like the 3-2-1 rule. And for people who are not familiar with it, that just says that if you want to keep your data safe, you have to have 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, so it can't all be sitting on the same storage array. And one of those copies needs to be off-site. And I think everybody can see the applicability of that or why that kind of rule is helpful. Now, things like the 3-2-1 rule are not good enough anymore now, because we have to also figure that we have potentially a threat actor, an adversary, who has been on our network for some length of time, who has compromised some level of administrative credentials, and has the ability to delete those extra copies that we have made under the 3-2-1 rule. So we have to now add to the 3-2-1 rule by adding that one or more of those backup copies need to be secured in such a way that even an adversary who has compromised admin credentials can't delete. There's a lot of ways to do that. You can do it very old school by just taking tapes out of the tape library if you're backing up to tape. And there are many on-prem and cloud-based object storage solutions that allow for immutability, that allow data in such a way that even our own administrators can't delete it until a certain length of time has elapsed. So that kind of capability is really critical now. And that's the kind of capability that you need to enhance old rules like the 3-2-1 rule. And of course, if you can leverage your backup data for alternate purposes, for secondary purposes like patch testing or digital forensics, in the case that you do have a security incident, that's all to the good too.
Right, that's a huge piece of it. And that idea that, especially in the age of ransomware, people are getting in and then just waiting. Right. setting up their attack and then waiting quite some time sometimes. So they have a lot of capabilities they've established on your own, network and in your system and in your data.
Absolutely.
So let's let's talk a little bit about Veeam's research. You guys do a lot in the data protection space. We just talked about ransomware. There's a pretty recent ransomware research piece that came out. What has that research shown on the topic of cyber resiliency when it comes to federal agencies in particular?
Well, great question, Vanessa. And we do actually do at Veeam the largest amount of research on data protection done by any organization, including analyst firms. The largest we do every year a data protection trends report. This year we surveyed over 3,300 organizations worldwide. We also, as you just mentioned, back in May, released our ransomware trends report. We surveyed 1,000 organizations that had been hit by ransomware. For public sector, one of the things that really jumped out in the data protection trends report, we asked the same question every year about outages. We asked all the respondents, could you tell us what was the cause of outages that you had to your IT estate, to your compute resources last year? And it's not a surprise. The normal suspects like networking outages, power failures, server operating system or application operating system crashes, that sort of thing, for most types of organizations are the most common causes of outages. By the way, public cloud resource outages were also in the top 10 on that list. But we asked the question in two ways. We asked, what's the most common cause of outages that you had? So list everything and tell us everything that caused you. And then we say, what's the worst outage that you had? What was the most impactful? What's interesting is that for all 3,300 plus respondents worldwide, the most impactful outage was based on a cyber attack. If folks had a cybersecurity incident that took them down, that was the worst pain that they suffered. That was the worst outage that they had. For public sector, cybersecurity incidents were also the most impactful, the worst outages, but they were also the most common cause of outages, which really isn't a surprise when you think about it, because we all know that public sector is under a state of constant attack, both from criminal gangs hoping for ransomware, but also from nation state actors. And so it's particularly important for federal customers that they really bring their A game to cyber resiliency, because obviously if they have a cybersecurity incident, it's going to be the most impactful outage, but it's also likely that that's going to be the most common cause of outages that federal agencies have.
Which makes a ton of sense. And I think sometimes people kind of think, oh, for cloud, we have FedRAMP, we have this baseline, but it's really not enough, right? Well,
it's not. And in fact, Vanessa, if I may, I'll actually share another ransomware trends report. We asked a really simple question. Again, 1,000 organizations worldwide that got hit by ransomware. We asked, where did the attacks compromise you? Where did you have data that was encrypted? We said, did it happen in the data center? We asked, did it happen at remote offices, or did it happen to your cloud resources? And over 50% of security professionals who responded to that survey that it happened in the cloud. They said that it happened in the data center, and they said that it happened in remote office. In other words, we might tend to think of ransomware as something that affects our data center, or we might tend to assume that ransomware is something that's going to target and or that kind of edge resources. But cloud is just as likely to be affected by a ransomware attack as any of the other resources that we've got out there.
Right. So you just have to do more. You can't just stop with the baseline. You've got to do more than that. Yep. So before we close, let's talk about why, what we're talking about today is really particularly relevant now. I think some of the things you just said point up to that, but there's probably a few other things you'd like to add.
Well, absolutely, Vanessa. We've seen, especially since the advent of COVID, a greatly accelerated push to remote citizen services and to remote work for the federal workforce. The corollary of that is that we've put a lot more things up in cloud software as a service or infrastructure as a service areas, workloads, data centers than we used to have in the past. A lot of things have moved off-prem to new locations. It's really critical that those be secured in the same sort of way that we've secured our on-prem workloads for many years. And when we talk about timing, of course, we're not fully out of the woods with COVID yet. And as we know, remote work, remote citizen services are going to be around for the foreseeable future. And the threat landscape now is different than it used to be. We have to remember that the single most destructive cyber attack in terms of dollar loss in history was not Petya 5 years ago. That was a direct result of Russian attacks on Ukraine via accounting software that was popular in the Ukraine. As we know, we've got a war between Russia and Ukraine going on now, and there are very definitely cyber aspects of that. So it's really important that federal agencies make sure that they are resilient, that they have protected their data in the right way, so that even if the international threat landscape gets more dire, we know that we can keep performing the service and keep performing the mission that our citizens expect of us.
Thanks so much for taking the time to share this cyber perspective and advice with us, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I want to thank our guest today, Jeff Reichert. He's the Vice President for Public Sector and Compliance Strategy at Veeam Government Solutions. To learn more about cyber resiliency, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Veeam Government Solutions. Have a great day.